Hello, hello, and more hello. So, recently, I've decided we need to talk about a new topic. Uh, a lot of this is going to be talking about the economy, which is, because I haven't done the art for it, is probably what you're going to see when I put this video together and it has a thumbnail. Uh, However, we have a lot of ground to cover. Uh, a while ago, I did one on tariffs, they are, how they're supposed to be used, how disastrous, what a lot of us in the US just watched recently when the most powerful individuals in the country decided to lay 10% flat tariffs on all goods coming in at a minimum. So, uh, I thought it was time to dig back into the economy. However, you might have noticed the text next to me, and there's a reason for this. We have to talk about why the economy is the way it is, and specifically, how this all interacts. So, you've probably heard that the top 10% of people in the country have 90% of the wealth. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but it did not always used to be this way. Uh, in around the 1950s, uh, a couple of decades basically after the New Deal. And if you don't know what the New Deal is, uh, let me know in the comments and I'll make you another video just on the New Deal and what it actually was. But suffice it to say, that was after uh, probably the worst depression of the economy that the US has ever experienced. That we had the New Deal to help us get out of that. Sadly, while some parts of the New Deal still exist, we stopped doing a lot of parts of that. And again, there's reasons why that I don't want to get too much into because they're very political, and I don't want to get into that politics area for this. We're talking economics and not politics here. But I think the first place we have to start is this number right next to me. The average household income in the US, which is, as it's highlighted, 66,622. I'm also going to show you the median income in a little bit. And to make you feel even more depressed, when I was a network admin, which is the highest my career ever progressed here in my state, I made 34,000. So I was making half of this, and that's the most I've ever made at any job I've ever worked. But yeah, that factors into something else that we should look at, which is this. First, the median salary is apparently $80,000. And the reason this is actually a little bit higher is because the salaries of people in the largest cities actually pull up those numbers. Because those are the ones that are usually making the most money. And for some reasons, which we'll touch on a little bit in a second, that's an important thing because the cost of actually living in those places tends to be higher. So the salaries have to be higher, or no one would actually be able to live there. pretty simple solution. However, if you look right below the median salary, a $40,000 salary would be below the United States Census Bureau's poverty threshold for families of up to 6 people. So, when I was making the most money ever, I would be considered to be in poverty. And I was a network admin at the time. So, yeah, something seems wrong there. We're gonna get into that, but I'm laying the groundwork first, so you understand. Now, obviously, where you live affects these, and I'm gonna show you a list in a little bit. But these numbers are important. Keep them in their head. So, yeah, 40K is poverty. If you make more than 40K, uh, theoretically, you should be lower class. However, because they like playing with those numbers, a lot of groups say that if you make $42,000, you're suddenly middle class. It's completely baseless because at 40K, we're in poverty. So lower class is just 40 to 42K. That math doesn't work. So realistically, lower class is even up to and including 100K a year. I couldn't get anyone to agree with that thought, but I think that's because they don't want to actually consider the reality, which is that either everyone that's lower class is now in poverty, or middle class is a lot higher than people would like you to think. So, let's jump to this. This is an important number too. What percentage of U.S. households make over 100K? And now, there's two aspects to this. Only 18% of individual Americans make more than 100K a year. 34% of U.S. households earn more than 100K a year. Basically, they're saying with two incomes, you can more regularly make above 100K. But individually, very few of us make more than that. This is important too, because remember, I just said middle class starts somewhere above 100K, realistically. And here we start to get into the why of it. And then I'm going to wrap this all back around and I'm going to lay out the numbers in a different way for you. What is a good household income, you might say? Well, California, and this is by research data, ranks the third most expensive for a single adult to live comfortably on their own at $113,652 to live comfortably in California on your own. Obviously, if you're not living in a big city, it's probably less. This is averaged out. And if you do live in one of those big cities, probably more. But the important part here is if you factor in two working adults raising two children, the total family income should be at least $276,724. And I think I got rid of. Yes, I did not save the image that I took, but only 12% of US households make over 200K. 12%. So basically, if you want to live comfortably in America, you have to be in that top 10% that has 90% of the wealth. I'm willing to say that this number is actually probably pretty darn close to what middle class really is these days in the US. So if you think you're middle class and you don't make that, uh, you might be lying to yourself. Uh, and I'm gonna lay this out because I have actually known someone who was a millionaire. Their total assets were over $1 million. They didn't live any differently because they didn't have real money, as they put it. Uh, they owned a controlling interest in a small company that had millions a year in income. They they were middle class. As crazy as that sounds, because their millions weren't made in a year. It was made over time. So yeah, they were middle class. And because they hadn't always been middle class, they didn't live extravagantly, which is why they had, you know, a million in the bank. That's not how we perceive that, but that is the reality. In fact, uh, CNBC did a nice little write up of what it takes, which is based on the same numbers that got us the numbers for California that we saw earlier. And yeah, Massachusetts was the highest, next to Hawaii, California, and New York. Washington, by the way, comes in third. I mean, fifth, but third in that block. As most expensive. And most other states fall somewhere below that. Though, how much is all over the place. Like Alaska's kind of high. In Arizona, uh, Colorado is actually kind of high. And so is Connecticut. Where, Hawaii. Maryland is kind of high. We know Massachusetts. My own state is actually pretty close. In Oregon is higher. So is Rhode Island. Virginia, very close. Very close. We know Washington. So yeah. If you want to know the cheapest state to live in, apparently it is North Dakota. I don't suggest moving to North Dakota, but and actually I expect you would make a lot less in North Dakota. So it's gonna reflect that. But I said we were gonna get back around to why these numbers are so important. So way back in the 1950s, something happened with wages. At least in the US. It didn't affect the rest of the world. In fact, when some parts of the rest of the world started to see trends towards the same thing we saw in the US, uh, their governments put restrictions in place that kept this from continuing. But we didn't do that here in the US. A lot of this is based on the demonization of the concepts of uh, communism, socialism, the isms, basically. Uh, there's a lot of mentality in the US. I certainly grew up with a lot of this, though my parents say they didn't, which is a little bit weird. I don't necessarily believe that. I know a lot of people their age that definitely did. But we were taught that, we had to be independent. We needed to be able to, like, make our own money, and we shouldn't rely on, like, other people or the government. That's all handouts. We can't have that in the US because that's socialism and communism. It is neither of those things, by the way, but we're taught, especially at a young age, that those things are bad. And a lot of the reason for that is because the countries we were theoretically at war with at that time were calling themselves communist or socialist. So obviously, those are the bad things. But it was easy to demonize those, so they did. There's a consequence, though, which is that in the 1950s, and you might have heard this quite a bit, but I don't think you realize how bad it is. But you've probably heard of stagnation in wages in the US and how the, like, average wage here has not grown to, like, match the growth of the economy. And that factors back to the time in the 1950s that I'm talking about. So, at that point, wages flattened. And I don't have a nice little chart for this. At least at the bottom, wages flattened. At the top, especially the top 1%, wages didn't flatten. They, in fact, increased noticeably. The people at the top of all the companies started to take more and more of the money that the business made as a total and pay less and less to the people actually making the things that the company sold, or the services that they were providing, which is what earned the company its income. And this is what really reduced the middle class in the US. We're going to touch on that a little bit very shortly. But if wages had kept growing the way that they should have to match inflation, this number, the average household income, should be twice that. Meaning that the average household income in the US should be enough to live comfortably in the US. Because it would be about 132K. Obviously, since the number is 66,000 and even looked at for the median income rather than the average, it's still only 80K and not anywhere near the 120. This means that wages grew about half as much as they should have to keep up with it with just inflation. And I should probably explain a little bit of inflation to you right now. So, when the economy grows, there's more money in the economy. This is what we call inflation. Because the more money there is in the economy, the less each individual cent or dollar or any other unit of currency that they represent. So, the more our economy grows, the more each unit of that money is actually worth less. I know that might sound strange because that is probably not how you've heard it defined before. At least sometimes. Some some places are honest about it, others not so much. But yeah, uh, that's how inflation actually works. That's why when the government just prints more money, inflation goes up because there's more money, and so therefore inflation rises. It's always that way. So the bigger our economy grows, the less each unit grows, and we call that inflation. Now, if everything goes together, and usually, like the cost of goods are very close to inflation. Some things might be a little higher, other things a little lower, but the average is going to be right along the line of inflation, which makes perfect sense, at least in the economist's view of the world. However, since we flattened out those wages, inflation has been rising without income rising for the vast majority of people. And the ones that get that extra, that's that top 10%. That's not that's not the other 90% of us that actually make the things and do the work. That is the top 10%. And I know that's hard for a lot of people to get into your heads. I mean, we've been trained by politics in the US that we want the rich to have tax cuts because that will trickle down to everyone below them. That's a lie. It's been a lie since Reagan. It was a flop when Reagan introduced it. It didn't trickle down anywhere. It just accelerated the fact that the people at the top get more money and the rest of us get less. I know that's potentially political. Some people like Reagan. Reagan economics, though, was horrible. The people advising Reagan are just con men. Con men who, by the way, are in that top 10%. So it was an advantage to them. That's why Trump loves tax cuts for the rich. He can always say, well, they're going to help you, but they're going to help that 12% that actually make more than 200K a year. They're not going to help anyone else. If you think they do, you're wrong. I can prove this. I can go into the numbers and show you how that does not work mathematically. I have relatives who think that they're middle class because they make about 100K a year in a state where it doesn't take 100K to live comfortably. So their perception is that they're middle class. What they don't realize is they're just barely making what someone who is actually lower class should be making now if wages had actually kept pace with inflation. But they think they're middle class. They vote like they're middle class. They don't understand. And I've never been able to convince them, even with the math, because their perception of reality is not that. Their perception is that they're middle class and that anything that goes against that isn't real. But I've just shown you the numbers. They're not middle class. I mean, some economists are going to say they're middle class because they live that lie. There are plenty of economists who do, in fact, find themselves in that top 12%. And they're the ones who make more because this exists. Of course, they're never going to tell you that this is the way things work. that would get them less money. This is, in fact, why the rich have been targeting programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Things that actually help the people they don't want to actually pay to do the work, to make the things. As much as they say that they love the working class person, it's that they love to abuse the working class person. Now, what does that $66,000 a year actually buy you? Because this is another important aspect. Remember, inflation's kept going. So, if we look at what someone could pay for in 1950 and compare it to what someone can buy now with that $66,000, what would that actually mean? Well, that means that you have the equivalent of about 30K in 1950s money. So basically, you can afford half of what someone could who had the same level of income in 1950. Half. Remember, I already told you you should be making twice as much, so this should not really be a surprise at this point. But this is the reality. In the 1970s, you might remember a little show called The Brady Bunch. This was a middle class family in the 1970s. Remember, that's the whole basis of the show. They're a middle class family. The dad is like a manager, I think. I haven't watched it in years, decades probably. But I remember growing up and seeing the reruns. Because it was already in reruns by that point. But it was on often enough that I would see it like after school because they loved it like before the news would come on, before the adults would get home. So it was one of the things that I would commonly see on TV. Lots of shows from like the early 1970s were in that category. So if you remember that show, this is a middle class family. What did the middle class family have? A mother, a father, 6 kids, which was because 3 came from each parent before uh, they got together. So they each had 3 kids. And there was one more person that was in the household. The housekeeper. Uh, you could call her a maid, maybe, whatever you want to think of her as. But if you were middle class in the 1970s, you could have a housekeeper. You could have a, I don't know, governess for your children, uh, a maid, whatever you would like to call it. In the 1920s, it would probably be a maid of all work. That would be what they'd call it. Because there were different classes of maids, most of which we inherited from the UK system of that. But yeah, you would have someone to keep your home for you if you're a middle class. So let's jump back to this $276,000. This person making that much could probably afford to have a maid. What does that tell you? What should that tell you? That this person is probably actually middle class. It is not the person making 113,000 that is middle class. Nope. Definitely couldn't have a maid. Even the poorest people aren't going to be able to fit into the salary that someone that makes 113K could afford. And people do, in fact, make about this much, and they'll have like a housekeeper or a maid. Usually, by the way, one of those illegal immigrants that they're trying to currently get out of our country. So they're making it even less affordable for the people closest to the bottom of that 12%. So, what do you think is the consequence of all of this? What is the consequence of the richest people deciding that they should have all the money and no one else deserves it? Because to them, we aren't human. We're only human when we have something they want. When we don't have that, they feel that we're trash and need to be thrown away. When we get too uppity, that we have to be put down. This isn't the first time this has happened in this country. I'd even arguably say this is about the third time. Because the era that they loved the most, post Civil War, as the railroads expanded across the entire country, and we had what these days would be billionaires or trillionaires, but back then were millionaires, like Rockefeller, the robber barons. And there's a reason we call them robber barons. Those people, those people, we put limits on. Right around the time of the First and Second World Wars. However, they already laid out the plan for this generation to do the same thing. That is the Elon Musks. That is some other people that I could call out. Those are all the billionaires we have now who learned the lesson from that era that Trump loves so much. When the robber barons would shoot you if you wanted to put a union together. Because unions actually helped us get out of that time. People died to get us out of that time. When the top 1% had 99% of the wealth of this country. And we're back there again. They're just as much robber barons now as there used to be. This is why they think of you as subhuman when you don't have their type of money. And to them, why should it? But yeah, this is why they have no problem destroying the economy. Because right now, the economy only benefits them. We've taken off all the restraints that kept them from making even more and more money off of our backs. Well, they earn all the actual wealth off of it. Do I have an answer? No. Without a government actually willing to stand up to them and take money out of politics, I don't expect our government to do the job that it did back near World War I and II, when they put restraints on that same category of people that limited them, and which led to the growth of things like the middle class in the US. Because if you were actually making 132K a year, which should now be the average income, two of you together would be very close to this number. So, The average person should be middle class. They're not. They're clearly not. You're making about a fourth of what you need to be middle class, on average. Heck, the most I've ever made was about an eighth of what it takes to be middle class, which is why I've known always that I grew up poor. I was in poverty. I never left poverty. I got a degree. I'm still in poverty, which is why I've never paid off my debts from going to college, because I've never managed to get out of poverty, even with a degree. It's also why I've never had an issue with anyone who is a different race and talks about being discriminated against and held down by the system. Because the system has always held me down too. It hasn't been there to help me. No, no. It's just there to sit and stew and wait for me. And then hammer me down whenever I get too uppity. But that is probably for another time. But I think we've shown why the economy is the way it is. Now, Europe is a good example of what our economy could look like. I'm not going to pull up the numbers right here because I don't want to get into talking about the rest of the world right now. But in Europe, there's a cap on how much more the people at the top can actually make than the average employee. Basically, across the EU, they all have laws about this. Some a little bit more than others, but generally, there's always a cap. I want to say Spain is like 10 times more than the average employee for the CEO. By the way, it's like 1,000 times in the US just for the average for that CEO. That's why CEOs make millions, and we might make like 80K on average. That's just how the math works. But they're not allowed to do that in the EU. So if they want to make more, the average employee needs to make more. This has kept them very much in line with inflation. The US is not like that. The independence and the thought that any person could become that millionaire or that billionaire keeps that from happening. Because the reason we tend not to want to punish the billionaires for not paying us right is because most of us think somewhere that, oh, I could be a billionaire. And then I'd have to give up half of my income to the government. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. However, that's an illusion. Elon Musk, he was never poor. His daddy had mines, gem mines, in South Africa, exploiting South Africans to make money. He's never been poor. He came here to the US and bought his way into a whole series of companies. He's been the financier, and that's how he's made all his money. I mean, some of that is a job as a con man, because He likes this picture of himself where, you know, he comes from these poor origins and he's made his way up as some sort of genius of technology. He doesn't know the first thing about technology. He's not an engineer. He's realized what could make good money and he's financed his way in. And then he takes credit for the whole thing. Tesla was never his idea. He came in after they were already established and already had their first car. I actually remember when he joined them. Uh, they had one vehicle, the Tesla Roadster, which had some issues that they were still working out, but was an incredible feat of engineering. He got rid of all those people that used to be his partners, one by one, until he was left holding the company. He doesn't talk about that. No. He built Tesla, is how he promotes it. That never happened. That's not the reality. He'd like it to be, though. I mean, arguably, things like SpaceX, uh, he bought into that as well, and then took it over when he bought it. But by then, he had enough money, he could just buy it outright. Still didn't develop it. He's no genius. He's intelligence-wise, he's probably a good bit below a genius. He's probably very average. Much like Trump, by the way. Not to get political, we're talking about business here. But Trump has managed to kill 8 casinos. Casinos are really hard to bankrupt. He's done it 8 times. This is not a businessman. This is someone who is handed an entire fortune and has managed to nearly lose it 8 times. He used loopholes in the system to finagle the money around in such a way that he never lost his fortune. But that just means he's a good con man. He's not a good businessman. Now, to have real money in this country is not something you do without already having money. The people who actually become rich off of an idea are very, very few. It's not even 1/100%. There are a handful of people that have made any significant money in this country in the last 2 decades without having money to start with. A lot of people talk about, like, Microsoft being a good example. Because Bill Gates came from middle class origins and he created this epic company that, is massive and made billions of dollars. But that's all a lie. That's a fantasy. His parents bankrolled the creation of Microsoft. And he did a lot of illegal crap to actually get where he is and make all of his money. But he was handed that money in the first place by his parents. He's no self-made man, as they put it. No, he exploited the system. They all exploit the system, because that's how they win and you lose. As long as you think that you can become one of them, then they win. That's how people that make nothing in this country will support someone who is a billionaire and say, oh, he's going to make us so much money. He knows what he's doing. Sure, that con man is going to be able to figure out how to actually make you more money I don't think that's ever the way this is going to work. Some people definitely can't see that, though. And before I get into a more political debates, because that is where this always ends up, because the only ones who can keep the rich in check is government. So it always becomes a political game at the end. Without government keeping the richest people in check, then they will always push down and always take the money for themselves. Uh, Elon's a great example of this. He makes $8 million a day in government welfare because his companies get $8 million a day from the government. What would be handouts? But if we get a handout when we make nothing, oh, that's not good. Shouldn't have handouts to those people. They should be working. I'm not the only one that's heard this millions of times. I've heard this my whole life. The government is there to help the people. That's the goal of a government. In fact, that is the only goal of the government, is to help its people. But that is a very different conversation. So, with that, let me end this for now. Have fun, take care, and see you later. Bye.